I returned to Boston on a sweltering summer afternoon, the suburban road leading to my parents' old house still shaded by maple trees just as it was in my childhood. In my hand was a bottle of red wine hastily bought in Manhattan, a small attempt to appear at ease though my heart felt heavy. This year's family gathering was as noisy as ever, laughter mixing with the clinking of silverware against the long table draped in white linen. I sat at the corner, forcing a smile, but a sense of isolation wrapped around me. In the middle of the toast, my sister Vanessa, adjusting her neat brown hair, calmly announced as if she were a lawyer standing in court. Starting next month, the rent for your apartment will rise to $8,600. The whole room erupted in laughter. My parents joined in, my mother's voice cutting sharply. You're grown now, you have to pay the market rate. You can't keep freeloading off your sister forever. I stayed silent, lifting the glass of wine to my lips, the bitter taste brushing my tongue but leaving behind the sweetness of a secret they had no idea about. That very building, the one I had been living in all these years, had already been under my name for months, registered through a company I quietly created. If you have ever felt belittled within your own family, do you think you would be strong enough to stand up and protect your worth? And where are you watching this story from? Let me know in the comments. Hi, my name is Emily Hart, 32 years old, and at times I feel as if my entire life has been nothing more than the faint shadow of my sister. From a very young age, I grew accustomed to being compared, and in everyone's eyes, those comparisons always seemed to work against me. Vanessa, 3 years older, was constantly praised as the shining star of the family. She excelled at school, spoke with ease, was adored by friends, and most importantly, she knew how to make our parents proud. As for me, even back in elementary school, I was branded the tag-along, the little sister who could never be talented enough to leave her own mark. I still remember vividly the family dinners when we gathered around the long oak table in the bright kitchen. A platter of roasted meat sat in the center, its aroma filling the room, yet the taste remains bland in my memory because it was always accompanied by the heavy weight of repeated questions. My mother often turned to me with a look half pity, half reproach, asking, "When will you ever be as stable as your sister?" I was 14, my hair tied hastily, my hands still stained with paint from art class, barely able to swallow a bite of mashed potatoes, before being thrust into yet another comparison. Across the table, Vanessa smiled confidently, boasting about the science project she had just won an award for. My father immediately nodded with pride. "My daughter truly has a bright future," he said. I wanted to share that I had just finished a painting my teacher had praised, but my voice was drowned out by the applause directed at her. My father gave me a quick glance and dismissed me with a short remark. "Painting won't get you anywhere, focus on your studies." My throat tightened, and suddenly the mashed potatoes turned bitter on my tongue. My high school years were no better. I applied to join the architectural modeling team, excited to present my idea of designing a small community garden for the neighborhood. But when I mentioned it at dinner, my father cut me off. "That doesn't sound practical at all. Look at Vanessa. She's about to join the debate team. Someday she might even become a lawyer." I lowered my head, disappointment weighing heavy in my chest. Every time I tried to kindle a spark of my own, my family quickly extinguished it by shining the spotlight back on my sister. I became the one behind the curtain, watching her step onto the stage, waving confidently at the admiring audience, while I silently cleaned up backstage. Yet, among all my relatives, there was one person who truly saw me, my grandmother Ruth. She lived in Brooklyn, in an old brownstone with a wooden spiral staircase and tall windows that caught the afternoon light. Every Sunday, I would take the train from Boston just to sit with her. In the living room, where the faint scent of chamomile tea mixed with aged wood, we spent hours talking about the smallest things. She listened as I shared my dream of becoming an architect, of creating spaces not just to live in but to heal in. She never mocked or dismissed me. Instead, she leaned closer, her eyes glowing with pride. "You don't need to be like anyone else," she said. "You just need the courage to write your own story." On summer afternoons, when sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, Grandma Ruth and I would go through the financial papers she had carefully kept in an old wooden box. She would have me read each certificate, patiently explaining how a house could become a legacy and how wise investments could protect a family for generations. I was only 16, but that feeling of being trusted made me grow in ways no praise from my parents ever could. Grandma taught me that true value does not come from being compared to someone else, but from whether you have the courage to see yourself clearly and walk on your own 2 feet. I remember once crying as I told her how invisible I felt in the family. She gently smoothed my hair and, in that warm, low voice, said, "Emily, you are the child who observes most closely, because you know what it is to be forgotten. And sometimes the ones who are least noticed are the ones who understand best how to build and support others. Never underestimate that power." Sitting beside her, listening to the pendulum clock ticking steadily in the quiet room, I felt for the first time that I had a place. Those memories became a source of comfort throughout my adolescence. While at home, I was dismissed as someone extra. In Brooklyn, I was heard and believed in. I carried her words into every small decision, choosing architecture as a path, facing failures with steadiness, and perhaps because of that quiet support. Years later, when opportunity arrived, I found the courage to rewrite my own story, a story that no one but me could decide. After my grandmother passed away, the brownstone in Brooklyn, the only place I had ever considered a true refuge, lost the warmth it once held. My parents quickly made arrangements to divide the estate, and the outcome was no surprise. Control of the property went straight to Vanessa. They said she was more practical, better at managing, and would ensure the family legacy wouldn't go to waste. Meanwhile, despite having a steady job in New York, I was dismissed as someone too irresponsible to be involved in serious matters. The day I signed a lease for a 2-bedroom apartment inside the very house where my grandmother had once nurtured my spirit, I felt as if I were walking into a tragedy already scripted. Vanessa set the rent at $2,400 a month. She called it a family discount, but I knew the truth. It was barely different from the market rate in Brooklyn, a neighborhood growing more expensive by the day. I forced myself to accept it, telling myself that at least I still had some part of my grandmother's presence close by. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, with windows facing a tree-lined street where morning light poured in, making the space feel larger. I arranged it neatly, set my drafting table by the window, and hung a few photographs my grandmother had cherished. To me, it was more than a place to live. It was an attempt to hold on to the last thread of connection with the one person who had always believed in me. But from the very first months, Vanessa's management turned living there into a string of tense days. She sent me reminder emails about paying rent on time, her words always rigid and condescending, as if I were some stranger renting her property. Once, just because my transfer was delayed by 2 days due to a bank error, she immediately cut off the hot water in my apartment. I had to shower in freezing water in the middle of winter, shivering inside the very room that had once been my grandmother's place of comfort. When I called her to ask why, she replied coldly, "You should learn to respect the contract. Family or not, the law is still the law." I wanted to scream back and ask what law allowed her to treat her own sister this way, but in the end, I just hung up in silence. Even the smallest repair requests became excuses for her to force me to cover the costs myself. One time, the kitchen pipe started leaking, and I reported it to her, thinking that as the property manager it was her responsibility. But Vanessa responded with a long email, citing clauses about basic maintenance falling under tenant obligations, and insisted I pay for the plumber out of my own pocket. As I sat reading those cold, lifeless words, it felt like she was no longer the sister who once played with me in our childhood, but a stranger willing to turn everything into a transaction for profit. Every month, when I transferred the rent money to my sister's account, a bitter taste crept into my heart. I wasn't just paying for a roof over my head, I was paying my own sister for permission to stay in the very place that had once been filled with my grandmother's love. On late nights, sitting alone at my drafting table, I would hear her gentle voice in memory. "You don't need to be like anyone else. You just need the courage to write your own story." I closed my eyes and asked myself if I truly had that courage, when even holding on to the smallest measure of respect from my family had become a battle. I knew I could file complaints or take legal action, but I chose endurance. Not because I was weak, but because I had decided to take a different path. I understood that arguing with Vanessa would only drag me deeper into the cycle she wanted to prove me dependent and powerless. Instead, I quietly prepared for the future. I cut down on expenses, saved every bit of income from my architecture work, and at the same time built up a small interior design company I managed on the side. I accepted extra projects after hours, working late into the night, with the light in my apartment often burning until 3 or 4 in the morning. They thought I was being cornered, but in reality, I was quietly gathering strength, waiting for the day I would break free. Living under Vanessa's management was like living in a gilded cage. On the surface, I had a stable apartment in Brooklyn, but inside, every day was marked by a constant sense of being controlled. She had a spare key, and more than once, while I was away on business trips, she entered the apartment without my consent under the excuse of checking the condition. I would return to find my belongings moved, the refrigerator opened, and my papers disturbed. I knew it was her way of sending a message. I was only a temporary guest in what she considered her territory. But there was something Vanessa didn't know. A secret only my grandmother Ruth and I shared. Before she passed away, on a drizzly afternoon in Brooklyn, she called me to sit beside her at the old wooden table in the living room. Slowly, she opened the familiar wooden box where she kept her important documents. This time, along with the usual folders, she placed a thick envelope in my hands. Inside was a savings book with a balance of nearly $280,000. She looked at me with eyes both stern and tender, her hands trembling slightly but her voice steady. "Emily, don't tell anyone about this, not even your parents. This is yours. Use it to create your freedom." I was nearly stunned, my heart pounding in my chest. For years, I had grown used to receiving less, to being excluded from important decisions, and now, for the first time, someone was giving me not just their trust, but a chance to step out from the shadow that had weighed on me for so long. In the days that followed, I lived with a mix of gratitude and a profound sense of responsibility. I didn't waste a single dollar. I continued working full-time as an architect in New York while also taking on small interior design projects to test my skills and build extra income. Each time I completed a job, whether it was renovating a modest apartment or designing a simple neighborhood cafe, I carefully transferred the profits into a separate account. Slowly, I learned how to make money grow instead of letting it sit idle in the bank. Part of it went into stocks of sustainable architecture firms, another portion into a friend's startup. I wasn't reckless, but I was no longer paralyzed by fear either. I knew my grandmother wanted me to stand on my own, and I treated every investment decision as a step in training myself. Over time, my interior design company grew from scattered small projects into a stable business. I hired a young associate fresh out of school but brimming with creativity. Together, we secured a contract to renovate a chain of local coffee shops, and that project brought not only a modest reputation in the industry but also enough savings for me to start thinking bigger. On the surface, I still played the role of the obedient tenant, dutifully sending rent money to Vanessa every month, but behind the scenes, I was steadily turning my grandmother's gift into the foundation of my independence. Then one day, an opportunity I had never imagined appeared. A real estate firm announced that my parents were planning to sell the brownstone to free up funds for their retirement and new investments. The news didn't come to me through family, but through a contact in the industry. For a moment, I was stunned. That house, the place where I carried so many memories of my grandmother, was about to be traded away for numbers on a ledger. I asked myself, if Grandma were still alive, would she agree? The answer inside me was crystal clear: no. I knew this was the moment to turn her words into action. I reached out to a lawyer, an old friend of my grandmother's with whom I had stayed in touch. He advised me to establish a limited liability company, an LLC, to quietly purchase the building without drawing attention. I spent many nights weighing every risk, thinking carefully about what this would mean. Finally, I signed the papers founding Hartwell LLC. The name was no accident. It was a blend of my family name, Hart, and the word well, a well of water, a symbol of patience, of quietly gathering strength to sustain an entire community. A few months later, through proper legal procedures and discreet transactions, Hartwell LLC officially became the owner of the entire brownstone. I paid my parents a fair amount, enough to satisfy them and keep them from asking too many questions. To them, it was just some anonymous investor acquiring the property. As for Vanessa, who was so sure she alone held the reins, she had no idea the real power had slipped from her grasp. She continued signing contracts, sending me reminder emails, still believing she ruled over the building like a little queen. I let her believe it. I wanted her to be comfortable on that imaginary throne, because nothing makes arrogance collapse faster than the truth revealed at the right moment. The irony was that from the day I officially became the owner, I felt lighter than ever when paying rent. Each check I wrote, each transfer I sent, I did so with a smile. Because I knew that money wasn't going anywhere, it was flowing right back into the very company I controlled. I was both the tenant and the landlord, and in that double game, I was the one holding the rules. I continued letting Vanessa manage the brownstone, using her as the perfect cover. I didn't rush to change anything, nor did I reveal a single clue. Quietly, I observed, keeping record of every controlling action, every self-important email she sent me. I never reacted, only saved everything in silence. I wanted to preserve it all for one decisive moment, the moment when truth would erupt, undeniable and irreversible. And while she kept believing I was the weak younger sister forced to bow under her authority, I grew more certain of what my grandmother had told me. That with enough courage, I could write my own story. And that story would begin with this very building. That reunion dinner felt like a courtroom in disguise, with Vanessa playing both judge and prosecutor while I became the accused, put on trial before the entire family. She didn't just rely on words, she had prepared an entire binder, thick with documents, colorful rent charts neatly bound inside. As the clinking of cutlery died down, Vanessa rose to her feet, adjusted her blazer, and spoke with a booming confidence. According to current market surveys, a two-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn averages $8,600 per month. Meanwhile, Emily only pays $2,400. That means she's pocketing nearly $6,000 each month, the money that rightfully belongs to this family. Murmurs spread across the table, a few relatives widening their eyes and nodding as if they had just heard convincing evidence. Vanessa opened her laptop and projected a rent chart onto the large screen in the living room, as if this were a presentation at a law firm. She continued, "I have been responsible for managing this building for years. I have not taken a single extra dollar from my sister, but clearly allowing her to pay such a low rate means I am sacrificing the family's interest to indulge her. Our family cannot keep tolerating this injustice." Her voice rose above the hum of the air conditioning, each word hammered home like a nail into the listeners' minds. A round of applause broke out from the relatives. My uncle, who loved numbers, praised her. "Vanessa is right, fairness must be clear. It shows she is responsible and willing to speak the truth." The clapping continued, a unanimous chorus of agreement. In everyone's eyes, Vanessa was not only the successful elder sister, but also the fair one who sacrifices for the family. And I, sitting silently at the head of the table, was cast as greedy and ungrateful, exploiting my sister's kindness. I scanned the room, searching for a sympathetic look, perhaps from Aunt Marianne, who had hugged me when I cried at 12, or from Cousin David, who once took me to a baseball game so I would not feel alone. But there was none. Everyone was silent or avoiding my gaze. They bent over their salad plates, slicing turkey with focused attention, as if their silence were a shield to protect themselves from trouble. In that moment, I recognized a bitter truth. No one wanted to take my side. No matter how hard I tried, in their eyes Vanessa remained the center, and I was only a shadow. Laughter erupted after Vanessa finished her speech, as if everyone had just watched a successful comedy performance. My mother leaned forward, her tone half joking, half serious. A grown daughter should know how to pay market prices. You can't keep freeloading off your sister forever. The table burst out laughing again, and within that noise, I could hear the pounding of my own heart, each beat sharp, painful, and cold. Yet not a single muscle moved on my face. I sat still, calmly lifting my wine glass to my lips as if nothing had touched me. From the handbag beneath the table, my phone buzzed softly. I glanced at the screen, a message from my lawyer, on the way. I drew a long breath, my fingers tightening slightly around the glass. The calm inside me wasn't born of resignation, but of certainty. I knew I held the trump card. All I had to do was wait for the right moment, and the game would flip entirely. Vanessa kept talking endlessly, presenting charts as though delivering her final prosecution. She ended by sliding a stack of contracts across the table toward me, her face triumphant, the diamond ring on her finger tapping against the table edge like a drumbeat of command. "Sign it, Emily," she said, her voice sharp and cold, not the advice of an older sister, but the order of a judge. "Sign it in front of everyone to prove you're no longer freeloading." The room fell silent. Only the low hum of the air conditioner remained, and dozens of expectant eyes bore into me. My parents stared at me with disappointment, as though I had dragged this farce on for far too long. I picked up the pen and lowered the tip to the page. The air seemed to freeze, relatives holding their breath in anticipation. Vanessa leaned toward me, her lips curling into an early smile of victory. But instead of signing, I lifted my head, looked straight into her eyes, and said, my voice calm yet resolute, "No." The faint clink of the metal pen dropping onto the table sounded like an explosion. The entire room fell silent. I could feel every stunned gaze, every breath caught in shock. An aunt blurted out, "What?" while my uncle coughed abruptly, startled. Vanessa froze for a moment, then her face flushed red with rage. She slammed her hand against the table, making the glasses rattle and ring. "You don't have the right to refuse. This is family property, and I am the manager. You must obey." I did not flinch, did not tremble. I only tilted my head slightly, my voice steady and measured as if I were presenting at an architecture conference. "It's you who has no right." A wave of murmurs swept through the table. Relatives began whispering, some glancing around in confusion. My father frowned, his tone hard and clipped. "Emily, stop arguing here. Sign it, don't embarrass the family." My mother folded her arms, her gaze icy and unyielding. But I did not waver. At that tense moment, the doorbell rang. The sharp sound echoed through the house, freezing everyone in place. I set the pen down on the table, calmly stood, and walked toward the door. My high heels tapped steadily against the wooden floor, each step reverberating in the heavy silence. When I opened the door, a man in a dark blue suit stepped in, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. It was Mr. Bennett, my lawyer. He nodded to me first, then turned to face the family with the polite yet piercing gaze of someone well-versed in courtroom battles. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice clear and confident. "I was invited here to clarify a few matters regarding the ownership of the building where Miss Emily currently resides." The room erupted in shock. Vanessa shot to her feet, her voice cracking. "Ownership? Who are you to interfere in this?" But before she could take another step, Mr. Bennett placed his briefcase on the table, opened it, and drew out a thick stack of documents, each neatly clipped and labeled with colored tabs. He calmly spread them out right beside Vanessa's contracts. I returned to my seat, folded my arms across my chest. Vanessa glared at me, her eyes burning with fury and a flicker of fear. "Emily, what are you doing?" she demanded through clenched teeth. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I took a slow sip of the wine left in my glass, then said softly, "I'm not doing anything, just laying out the truth." Mr. Bennett did not rush. Every movement was deliberate, steady, as though he was well accustomed to commanding the attention of an entire room. He drew out the carefully prepared files, flipping each page before placing them neatly on the long table. "This is the certificate of ownership from the New York Land Registry, Fully notarized, he said, his voice carrying through the silent room. The legal owner is Hartwell LLC, a company established by Emily Hart 3 years ago. A wave of murmurs rippled across the room. Relatives glanced at one another, some leaning in to study the bright red seals stamped on the copies of the documents. One by one, Mr. Bennett laid out more evidence: annual tax filings, wire transfers for the purchase, maintenance contracts. Everything was undeniable. As I looked at each document, a rush of emotions rose inside me, relief laced with bitterness. For 3 years, I had quietly shouldered the burden, paying every tax, guarding this secret, so that today the truth could be placed on the table before the very people who had once branded me a freeloader. Vanessa staggered back, as if struck in the chest. Her voice cracked as she stammered. "No, this can't be. I manage this building. I've handled everything all these years." Her eyes darted desperately around the room, seeking solidarity from our parents, from the relatives, but all she met were uneasy, doubtful stares. I tilted my head, my voice calm but each word dropping like a stone. "Yes, you manage it. But have you ever asked yourself, who are you managing it for?" The question cut through the air. Every whisper died at once, as if the entire room had frozen solid. Vanessa stood rooted to the spot, her lips moving but no words coming out. My father slumped back in his chair, his hand trembling as he held a glass of water he couldn't bring himself to drink. My mother's face had gone pale, her eyes fixed on the seals stamped across the documents, as if staring hard enough might make them vanish. Mr. Bennett continued, his tone objective, professional. "To clarify, every property tax for the past 3 years has been paid by Hartwell LLC. All major maintenance expenses from electrical systems and plumbing to fire insurance have been fully covered by the company. What Miss Vanessa refers to as sacrifice is, in fact, merely management work the company allowed her to carry out as a temporary representative." A few relatives gasped audibly, too shocked to contain themselves. I saw Aunt Marianne raise a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Uncle David leaned back in his chair, shaking his head and muttering, "My God, all this time." Vanessa's voice broke into a furious scream. "You deceived everyone. What game are you playing, Emily? Did you do this just to humiliate me?" I turned to her, meeting her eyes directly without the avoidance that had defined my childhood. "No, Vanessa. I didn't deceive anyone. I simply stayed silent and did what needed to be done. The one who deceived others is you by painting yourself as a martyr while living in an illusion of power that only existed because someone allowed it." The murmurs rose again, but this time they carried no support. Instead, they were filled with doubt and quiet reproach. "So that's how it is. Unbelievable. Poor Emily." The air in the room shifted, like a sudden change in the wind's direction. My father finally spoke, his voice rough and uncertain. "Emily, when did you buy this building?" I looked him squarely in the eyes, refusing to turn away. 3 years ago, I used the money Grandma left me, along with what I earned myself. I paid full market price, and every document is legitimate." He lowered his head, his hand trembling as it rested on his knee, saying nothing more. My mother sat in silence, her eyes glistening not from sympathy for me, but from the shame the truth now forced her to confront. Vanessa still tried to shout, "No, I don't believe it, you couldn't possibly have done this." But her voice weakened, as if the evidence spread across the table had already stolen the breath from her lungs. I leaned back in my chair, calm as I delivered the final words. "You can still manage, if you choose to do the job properly, but the truth is, the power was never yours to begin with." The room grew heavy with silence. All those who had applauded Vanessa moments earlier now avoided her gaze. The truth, laid bare, needed no further words from me. I simply sat there, calm and steady, letting the silence speak for itself. And in my heart, I heard my grandmother's voice echo, "Have the courage to write your own story." Today, that story had turned to an entirely new chapter. After that family gathering, with every document laid out in the open, I knew I could never allow things to return to the way they were. I went back to Brooklyn and stepped into the brownstone my grandmother had cherished this time, for the first time, as its rightful and public owner. I walked through the familiar hallway, past walls stained with old watermarks, up the creaking wooden stairs that groaned under every footstep. Each mark reminded me how, for years, this house had been neglected under careless management. And now, it was my turn to write a new story for it. I called a reputable maintenance company in New York and asked them to inspect the entire building, the electrical wiring, plumbing, heating, and even the roof that had leaked through countless rainy seasons. The workers arrived carrying toolboxes and measuring equipment. They climbed onto the roof, shone flashlights into the old pipes, and replaced worn-out switches. I stood in the middle of the living room, listening to the hammering and drilling, a strange excitement rising in my chest. This was more than just repairing a building, it was the act of claiming ownership, of proving to myself that I was strong enough to protect my grandmother's legacy and transform it into a new source of life. Alongside the maintenance, I contacted an interior design company, the very small firm I had been building for years. I wanted to take this chance to bring my own ideas into the space, more natural light, environmentally friendly materials, and small bursts of greenery on the balconies. I wanted the brownstone to be more than just a residence. I wanted it to breathe renewal, just like the journey I was living through myself. When the first apartment was finally renovated, I listed it at market price. Within 2 weeks, a young artist couple signed the lease. They looked around at the sunlit room and exclaimed, "It's hard to believe this was once such an old, neglected building." I smiled, pride swelling inside me. The next apartments were rented just as quickly, and with each contract I signed, I felt as if I were laying down another solid brick in the foundation of my independence. With Vanessa, I had no intention of evicting her right away. I knew doing so would only create more noise and give her an excuse to keep playing the victim. Instead, I sent her a new lease, this time under my name as the owner. The rent was no longer a so-called family discount, but the full market rate, just like every other tenant. When she received the contract, Vanessa called me, her voice shaking with anger. "Who do you think you are, sending me this?" I answered calmly, "The landlord. And you have 2 choices, sign or find somewhere else." There was a long silence on the other end before the line abruptly went dead. In the weeks that followed, I saw less of Vanessa. She avoided me in the hallways and stopped sending the overbearing emails she once did. I knew she was scrambling to figure out her next move, but this time the power was no longer in her hands. And I no longer felt that old fear whenever a message from her appeared, because every word, every demand, now echoed hollow and powerless. The strange thing was that throughout this process, I didn't feel the triumph I once imagined. There was no moment when I wanted to stand above her and laugh at my victory. Instead, what I felt was relief. Relief that I no longer had to live in an apartment where every dollar I paid was laced with bitterness. Relief that, for the first time, I could decide for myself what happened in my own space, from how to hang a picture to signing leases with new tenants. Relief that, at last, my grandmother's words had come true. I had found the courage to write my own story. At night, standing by the window of my apartment and looking down at the street glowing under the yellow lights, I saw streams of people passing by, strangers' faces, yet all full of life. I thought about how this house would soon welcome new residents, people unconnected to the old wounds but who would help form a new community. In my memory, I saw my grandmother smiling, her kind eyes watching over me from somewhere unseen. I also began setting new boundaries, not just with Vanessa but with my parents as well. I no longer allowed them to pull me into arguments about family bonds or duty. I told them directly, I will not let anyone belittle me again. I still respect family, but my boundary is fairness. My parents stayed silent, neither opposing nor acknowledging me. But for me, that no longer mattered. I had long since grown used to living without their praise. What I needed was peace within myself, and for the first time, I found it right here under this roof. In the days that followed, as the sounds of drills and hammers gave way to the quiet of a house being renewed, I walked down the freshly painted hallway and breathed in deeply the scent of wood and new paint. I felt as though my own spirit had been repainted brighter, fresher. No more shadows of comparison, no more weight of mocking words. What remained was only me, Emily, a free woman, building a life of her own choosing. In the first weeks after the new lease was sent, Vanessa kept an unusual silence. I almost thought she might quietly move out, but one evening, just as I returned from the office, my phone rang. Her name lit up the screen, one I knew too well. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. Vanessa's voice was no longer sharp and commanding but subdued, tinged with pleading. Emily, I know you're angry, but we're still sisters. Can you lower the rent for me? Just by half. You can afford it. Think of it as keeping our bond. I froze for a moment, listening to her repeat the words, we're sisters. But in every syllable I didn't feel connection, only an excuse to continue taking advantage. I drew a deep breath and replied firmly. No. This isn't about affection, this is about boundaries. I won't diminish my own worth just to make you comfortable. No. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds, then it shifted into her familiar tone of irritation. You're so selfish, Emily, you've changed. You weren't like this before. I gave a bitter smile. No, Vanessa, I just stopped letting you write my story for me. I hung up before she could say another word. A week later, Vanessa officially refused to sign the lease. She packed her things and left in anger, not even bothering to say goodbye to anyone in the building. I stood by the window, watching the moving truck carry her belongings away from the street. My heart felt both relieved and faintly sorrowful. Relieved, because at last there would be no more condescending emails, no more heavy footsteps in the hallway that made me hold my breath. But sorrowful, because the bond of sisterhood, distorted as it was, had now ended in this way. I thought things would settle down, but soon after, my parents began calling me. My father's voice was heavy, laced with fury. You destroyed family ties over money. Do you know how much your sister is suffering? You're so heartless, Emily. My mother added, even strangers know how to care for one another, and yet you can't even care for your own sister. Living this rigidly, how can you ever be happy? I listened without interrupting, but a storm of emotions churned inside me. In the past, words like these would have been enough to keep me crying through the night, convinced I was the unfilial daughter, the one who ruined harmony. But this time was different. I sat upright, my voice calm. If you think love can be measured by rent money, then maybe that love never truly existed. The conversation fell into silence. I heard a sigh, then the click of the line being hung up. I knew that from now on the distance between my parents and me would only grow wider. Yet, strangely, I did not collapse as I once would have. I felt steadier inside, as if at last I had learned to stand without needing their approval. In the days that followed, relatives began to gossip. Some called me half reproachful, half sympathetic. Others sent messages. After all, you are sisters, you should give a little. But there were also a few who whispered privately, Emily, you did the right thing. Vanessa has long treated you with contempt. I no longer bothered to prove whether I was right or wrong. I understood that the issue was never really about money. The problem was that for many years I had been treated as invisible, demeaned to the point that all my worth was denied. And when I stood up to defend myself, they could not accept it. At night, after work, I often sat on the building's stoop. Wind rustled through the trees, and the streetlights cast a glow against the old brownstone walls that were slowly being renewed. I thought about family, about the growing distance. Of course it still hurt. Deep down, I had once longed to be seen and loved. But now I knew I was no longer bound by that need. I had a choice, to choose dignity over cheap approval. The brownstone stood silently, like a witness. 3 years ago, it had been a burden, a symbol of oppression. Now it was the emblem of the freedom I had claimed with my own hands. And every time I walked through the clean hallways, inhaling the scent of fresh paint, I remembered my grandmother's words. Never underestimate your strength. I smiled to myself. Because at last, I understood that strength was not about revenge or proving myself superior. True strength was daring to live by my own worth, even when my own family turned their backs on me. One late autumn evening, as I returned from the office, the Brooklyn streets glowed under warm yellow lights. The air was crisp, maple leaves scattered across the sidewalks, painting a scene that made the heart grow heavy. I stopped at the stoop of the brownstone, adjusting the scarf around my neck. Just as I was about to step inside, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the corner wall. Vanessa. She wore a long black coat, her wavy brown hair falling loose, her face stripped of its usual pride and marked instead with exhaustion. Her eyes met mine, and she whispered, her voice hoarse as the wind, "You've changed." I stood still, looking straight into those eyes that for so many years had only gazed at me with disdain. This time, I felt no hatred, no longing for recognition, only a gentle release. I answered slowly, my voice calm but steady. "No, I just stopped letting you write my story." As the words left my lips, the hollow space in my chest felt as if it had finally been filled. Vanessa pressed her lips together, said nothing more, and turned away. Her figure grew smaller and smaller under the streetlights, and I knew that moment marked the end of all the power games, comparisons, and contempt she had once used to bind me. I sat down on the stoop, the same place where my grandmother had often sat with me on summer afternoons long ago. Looking up, I saw the brownstone rising tall in the soft yellow light, both old and renewed after its restoration. It was no longer just property, no longer just a victory in a family dispute. It had become a symbol of the journey I had traveled, from a child dismissed and overlooked to a woman who could stand firmly on her own. I smiled faintly, whispering to myself, the real victory was never about defeating her, but about conquering the fear of being dismissed that had haunted me for so many years. In the days that followed, my life gradually moved into a new chapter. In the mornings, I worked at the architecture office. In the afternoons, I stopped by the brownstone to check on renovations and chat with the new tenants. A young couple had just placed pots of lavender on their balcony, and children's laughter from a neighbor echoed through the hallway. Watching that scene warmed my heart. This was exactly what my grandmother had wanted, a home not only for shelter, but for nurturing life and connection. From time to time, my parents still called to scold me, repeating the same line that I had put money above family. But now I only listened, without harsh replies, and without the sharp pain I once felt. I understood that I could never change how they saw me. And the truth was, I no longer needed their approval. I had learned to set boundaries so that they could no longer define my worth. I began devoting more time to myself. I signed up for a yoga class near my home, joined a book club every Saturday, and continued to grow my interior design business. The projects I took on were no longer just about making a living, but about the joy of creating. I realized that once I stopped being haunted by constant comparisons, my energy became clearer, lighter. I was creating spaces for myself and for others built on sincerity, not on forced efforts to please anyone. Once, I was invited to give a talk at my old architecture school. In front of dozens of young students, I shared my journey. I told them about the times I was belittled, about living like a tenant in the very place tied to my childhood, and about how I eventually rewrote my own story. When I finished, I said, true worth doesn't come from someone else's recognition. It comes from daring to define yourself, from standing tall even when the whole world turns away. The hall went silent for a few seconds, then erupted into thunderous applause. In that moment, I heard my grandmother's voice echoing from memory. "You've done it, Emily." On another evening, I sat alone on the stoop of the brownstone, watching the city lights shimmer against the rain-slicked street. A cold wind swept by, yet inside me there was an unfamiliar peace. I closed my eyes, recalling every step of the path, the suffocating family dinners, the nights without hot water, the countless times I swallowed tears instead of speaking back. All of it had led me here, to this moment, where I sat not as someone defined by others' gaze, but as a person free to define herself. I know the road ahead will still hold many challenges, and old wounds will not disappear overnight. But now, I carry them as part of the memory that shaped me, no longer as a burden. I see clearly that true worth does not come from the recognition of a toxic family, but from daring to write your own story. And my story has finally broken free from the pages others once tried to force me into. That night, as I stepped inside my home, the soft golden light filled the living room. I smiled to myself. I didn't need to defeat anyone, I only needed to be myself. And for me, that was the greatest victory of all. To everyone watching this video, if you have ever felt hurt or lost trust within your own family, please remember you are not alone. Life may take away recognition from those closest to you, but it can never take away the true worth that lies within you. Every step you take forward, every choice you make with confidence, is proof that you are stronger than what the past once told you. Believe that you deserve a life that is fair, kind, and whole, and that you have the power to write a new story for yourself. Thank you for listening. See you next stories.